Hi, this is Paul. I want to talk about metagelicalism because I think that's the new neo-evangelicalism. Citing of it this morning, Richard Rowland, I was able to present for and assist this morning in the baptism of my best and oldest friend. The sheer number of miracles necessary to make this happen turned out to be no problem for God and his saints. Never stop praying for that person in your life. You never know what God is doing. And here, I first thought it was in Texas because Richard is in Texas, and then he said no, it was in Washington. So here we have a baptism. The trough is painted. Someone in the comments said, I was baptized in a trough that wasn't painted, baptized Orthodox. You have Orthodox vestments. You have a fairly Spartan space. Metagelicalism. The word first came to me as I was pondering this piece by Dreer, Rod Dreer. I think Rod Dreer, Paul Kingsnorth, these guys are sort of the tip of the spear of metagelicalism. And I know a bunch of you are going to say, no, it's orthodoxy. And I'm going to say, color me skeptical. I think what rolls out will be more like the 2020 version of neo-evangelicalism than it will be just orthodoxy taking over. Matt C., well known in the corner, very closely associated with Jonathan Peugeot's Fairytale Project. I very much seen that my rural Carolina PCA used the same horse trough baptismal growing up. Yep, that's nothing new. Food truck Emily baptized in a cow trough by her former grandpa. Tiberius Drew, I was drawn to orthodoxy because of the paradigm shift from rational materialism, that is. I'm not swapping worldviews. My worldview didn't survive the meta-analysis. I can't get on top of orthodoxy life like I can other things. I'm glad it's happening. My Orthodox baptism trough wasn't even painted. Someone had a comment about $1 million of, oh yeah, it's certainly different from spending $1 million on tiling the floor. The Riverside Orthodox mega church in Riverside, California, where there's $1 million of stone on the floor, they had a beautiful stone baptistry, but I think we are, and like neo-evangelicalism, and so the neo sort of got truncated and taken off, just became evangelicalism. I think metagelicalism is morphing and growing. The boundaries are going to be difficult to see, but the difference between, let's say, neo-evangelicalism and metagelicalism is going to be the inclusion of Catholics and Orthodox in this movement in the United States and more broadly in the West. One of the best books it's a little dated now, but one of the best books I can recommend on neo-evangelicalism is Molly Worthen's Apostles of Reason. And she wrote this long before she herself now has converted into an evangelical megachurch. But again, even in her conversion story, there's all of these, even though she went evangelical, she definitely had to wrestle with, let's say, Anglicanism, high church, and what I see sort of coming together. And in some ways, Richard Rowland is kind of an archetype of metagelicalism in terms of what is happening. Jonathan Peugeot, these men have roots in evangelicalism. For Peugeot, obviously coming from, let's say, state-sponsored Catholicism in Quebec into evangelicalism and now into orthodoxy. And I would argue that these boundary lines are going to be so blurry, even someone like the Philosophical Silk Road and Vervaeke are going to be adjacent. And evangelicalism, neo-evangelicalism, had those kinds of unchurched adjacencies as well. I would argue that, let's say, late stage neo-evangelicalism, which was really the seeker movement, was grappling with those fuzzy edges, and now we're really seeing sort of this thing taking off. Now, some of you are going to be pressing me to really define this, and by defining it, you're going to want me to define the borders. And at this point, it's much more a sensibility. It's much more centered set than bounded set, and just like even though you had the Bebington quadrilateral to try to, you can look that up on Wikipedia, to try to define neo-evangelicalism, I don't think metagelicalism is really going to be easily defined. I think we're going to, again, recognize it much more spiritually, and I don't mean that in sort of a punting, woo-woo way. I mean that in the sense of, like many other things that we are noticing now, we are picking up a sensibility, we are picking up an intuition, we are picking up a vibe, we are picking up something that is much more like a spirit that is moving through and gathering people, institutions, and now these new kinds of institutions that we see creating in a space like YouTube. So I always feel like I'm late to the parties on a lot of the gossip. Dave Busatil mentioned gossip in the December 13 estuary live stream, and so then, like yesterday or the day before, I heard that Brett Cooper left Daily Wire, and because, of course, I'm I guess I'm Daily Wire adjacent in terms of my relationship with Spencer Clavin and my study of Jordan Peterson, even though Jordan Peterson is the only thing I ever watch on Daily Wire. Brett Cooper, I had seen 4 or 5 of her videos in the past, didn't really follow her, not really my demographic, but she left Daily Wire, and so then I had to sort of make sense of this, and because I'd met Ruslan at the Ark, I felt a certain, again, notice all the sensibilities here, all the relationality, even the parasocial relationships. I at least have some mapping of Ruslan, and I mocked his thumbnails, and so I teased him, and he teased me at the art conference over his thumbnails. But, I tried to get some sense making with respect to Brett Cooper, and it seems that, okay, Brett Cooper was big enough and successful enough that even though her producer, which probably should receive some of the credit for creating the Brett Cooper avatar that performs on YouTube, and they very much sort of mimic her style. She, of course, she's grown bigger than her contract because they sort of, unlike Jordan Peterson, who sort of came in big, she grew bigger than her contract, and so now she's going to head out on her own and be her own thing. And of course, watching this just reminded me of all of the business behind YouTube. Plus, Rick sent me that video on the whole honey scam done by PayPal, scamming all the big YouTube influencers out of their affiliate money. But again, it just sort of reminded me about how all of these principalities and spirits and sensibilities are playing now in the realm of virtuality, digital media, etc., etc. And that's not going to be, the metagelical thing that's happening now is by all means deeply sort of intertwined with all of this. The metagelical is also going to be quite cross-pressured. And again, as I said, Rod Dreer has, I think, always been sort of the tip of the spear of the metagelical wave. And I really felt this as Well, so first things published a text version of Kingsnorth's speech, and because there are in fact membranes between, let's say, the blogosphere, and Dreer is mostly a blogging entity, even though he'll appear on channels to promote his book, but he's mostly a text entity, whereas at least at this point I'm mostly a video entity, and would argue that Peterson remains mostly a video entity. I did a member video on the first chapter. It's not really chapter 1 in his We Who Wrestle with God, but it's really the first chapter or the introduction to that book, and I put it in the membership section. I doubt it's worth $3 for you, so but it's not a grift. But I knew that, okay, Kingsnorth, New Orthodox, Western Orthodox. Martin Shaw, Western Orthodox. I will be appearing with Paul Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw in Galway, Ireland, before ARC in February. Details to follow. They're already out there on Twitter. Marcus of More Christ is putting that event together. But we're doing it in a Roman Catholic spot and in conversation with Roman Catholics. I think this is deeply metagelical. And you'll notice I was super interested when Paul Kingsnorth gave his speech, because I was super interested in terms of what Rod Dreer would do with that speech. Well, with this post, I got my answer. And basically what shows up are many of the cross pressures within Rod Dreer. I have taken to calling the strange, dissolving, increasingly nihilistic moment we are living through a culture of inversion. We can best understand the process, I think, by simply observing that our elites today are focusing overwhelmingly on inverting the culture that we took for granted when I was growing up. The inversion takes many forms and can be in almost every crevice of society now, from the curriculum in schools to the output of the Disney Corporation. Turning everything on its head is the work of the West today. Now, if you pay your money to Daily Wire and you listen to Jonathan Peugeot treat the Gospels, you will hear, and I think quite rightly, how Jesus is there's this inversion is the inversion of the West in many ways was invented by Jesus, because it's not simply a coup d'etat in which the leaders are killed. It is a continual churning, which is much less violent, generally speaking. And Jesus gets this from the Hebrew prophets. Now, what we've seen is so much inversion that it has sort of become a stench, because some of the inversion goes to fruitless ways, sterile ways. Some of the inversion produces geldings, thinking about C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. But a lot of the inversion is part of what I think a lot of how Jesus colonizes and smuggles and conquers is through inversion. In fact, you could argue that the cross itself, being crucified by the empire you are going to conquer, is in fact an inversion. And so part of the reason that the West is continually working through these inversions is because of the Jesus code that was put into the West and that the West is manifesting. And now that orthodoxy is coming in, orthodoxy is going to be subject to many of those same things. Now, I think part of the reason people have grabbed onto orthodoxy is that they sense the sensibility of orthodoxy, that there's some more inversion resistance in it, whereas in a lot of neo-evangelicalism and certain wings of neo-evangelicalism, there's a lot of just running crazy with inversion. And you'll see this in Twitter streams that are sort of mocking Protestia. There's a Twitter they're always pointing out sort of the crazy end of evangelicalism And when Jonathan Peugeot says something like, when I go to an evangelical church and it becomes Cirque du Soleil, I'm out of there. So Dreer agrees. I hardly agree with Paul's diagnosis, which is why I wrote the Benedict option. And again, for a lot of this, Dreer's Benedict option is going to be an important resource. More about that, Paul talks about 5 ways in which people talk about religion more. Finally, we have the subject of civilizational religion. This phenomena comes to the fore in times of upheaval and crisis, seeing that the culture is in trouble and understanding that a particular religion was at its heart. The civilizational religionist seeks to use religion to rebuild culture regardless of its truth. And again, this aspect, which of course Peugeot has talked about, that and I think we're going to get into this in Galway, Ireland, is okay. And when Paul Kingsnorth talked about this, I knew, okay, but here's the irony. It's not only the blood of the saints that's the seed of the church, and Orthodoxy gets this better than a lot of places. The blood of the saints is the seed of the civilization. The monks in the desert are the foundation of the civilization. That's one of the things that Orthodoxy has really brought to the fore into the neo-evangelical conversation, because neo-evangelicalism was all about civilizational religion, because it was, in a sense, an outgrowth of early 20th century fundamentalism. You can read George Marsden on this in American Fundamentalism. You can read Amy Worthen in this, but it was an outgrowth of fundamentalism, but it was a form of fundamentalism that wasn't as antithetical. And so this right away forces me into the question, how metagelical is someone like Doug Wilson or the hardcore Christian nationalists? And I think just like with evangelicalism and neo-evangelicalism, there are fringes to these that sort of go in all different directions. And so I've often said that evangelicalism is not an ecclesiology, but rather a marketplace of ideas. I think metagelicalism is also a marketplace of ideas. And so what we see is an intra-orthodox conversation happening in this Dreer post between Dreer and Kingsnorth. Now, finally, again, back to this is really nice, and I thought, okay, I could find I probably don't have time this week. These weeks for me during my wife's holiday and Christmas, it's a weird time in terms of my schedule, so I don't know what kind of video output there will be, just because I will be prioritizing spending time with people in my church and spending time with my family. And because people are more available during these holiday weeks, those things go up and I have less office time. And if I have less office time and I still have messages and stuff to do, videos get the short shrift. It's just the way it is. So, and now that we have a corner, the corner can pick up the slack. I'm sure Chad has been doing some long live streams in the morning. We'll see what happens with Luke. I would imagine that, like me, Luke Thompson is probably going to be in a similar situation where when the kids are in school, he can do his live streaming, and he can't really so much right now. Probably for some of the single people, that might be inverted, depending on whether they're traveling to see family. Anyway, back to Kingsnorth. I decided to use him in written form rather than video form because that's what Dreer is doing. Finally, we have the subject of civilizational religion. This phenomena comes at the fore in times of upheaval or crisis. The civilizational religionist seeks to use religion to rebuild culture regardless of its truth. And there is a tell of the apostles' reason of phase of neo-evangelicalism. But of course, Paul Kingsnorth didn't come via evangelicalism. He came through what neo-evangelicalism and Paul Kingsnorth had in common, which was modernity and its preferential for truth. Yet Paul Kingsnorth is by no means a modernist. He is very much let's say, an IDW downstream person like myself. He mentions Ayaan Hirsi Ali's statement announcing her embrace of Christianity, including her recognition that no one cannot oppose the barbarism of Islamic fundamentalism with weak secularism. Paul lays into Jordan Peterson for his encouraging people to embrace Christianity because it works as a form of psychological therapy. Both Ali and Peterson, according to Paul, push civilizational Christianity. And just like neo-evangelicalism had sort of a quietist or Anabaptist wing, even though Kingsnorth is Orthodox, he is going to inhabit that wing of Western Orthodoxy in this metagelical new world we're coming into. Now, of course, it's interesting in the way that Dreer sort of pushes back. I agree with nearly all of this, Dreer says, but I'm not as radical as Paul. Okay, what spectrum are they both on? They're both on the metagelical spectrum. I agree wholeheartedly that we don't re-Christianize the West by seeking to do so through political power. But if you read enough Rod Dreer's blog, now, when I say Rod Dreer is an alarmist, I don't mean that as an insult, but that is sort of the function that Dreer has had that I've seen in terms of the rise of metagelicalism. And the way that Dreer has, I think, contributed to the infolding of certain Catholics and certain Orthodox, but probably percentage-wise, an increasing number of Orthodox into the new metagelical sphere. And then he writes about, of course, one of the big pieces of Dreer's narrative has been Hungary. Yet I cannot go as far as Paul if he is advocating Christian Quietism, which he might not be. It's not quite clear. And again, Paul Kingsnorth, I don't know, is quite clear on this either. I think Paul Kingsnorth, as now in this new influencer, either by Substack or video, this new metagelical influencer sphere where whole bunches of us, myself including, Dreer including, Jordan Peterson including, Peugeot including, are thinking out loud towards, rather than, let's say, the mid-modernity print media, where just by virtue of the gatekeepers, publishing, technology, there is a time difference. I mean, we will know what happens with Dreer or myself or Peterson, not so much Peterson, because the bigger you go, the binding and blinding dynamics intensify, but we will know them almost instantly. And it could be, in fact, that our audiences maybe, because there's so much projection that happens in there, maybe know us before we do, even though probably 90% of that knowing us before we do will get it wrong. But 10% will probably nail it. It's that kind of highly spiritual spot that we are making. So Dreer, here in Hungary, the Orban government is open about doing what it can politically to shore up and defend Hungary's Christian roots. But it does not seek to impose the Christian faith on people except in indirect ways. And that right there is where a lot of this tension is going to be. The indirectness, the inversion that Jesus does to sort of smuggle people into the faith. I was listening to Gavin Palmer this morning on Chad's live stream recount his conversion story, where he was trying to make he's a coder, he's trying to make an AA that cares, and sort of in an Ayaan Hirsi Ali move, discovers that, oh my goodness, there is already a spiritual force that cares, and it's Jesus, so why don't I serve Jesus? And that then provokes his conversion into the church. But you'll notice, just like evangelicalism, neo-evangelicalism, metagelicalism, its relationship with institutional ecclesiastical bodies is not abundantly clear. It, like neo-evangelicalism, tends to be a marketplace of ideas, or let's say a spiritual exchange outside the structured walls of churches. Now, those structured walls of churches are not going away. Again, back to Marshall McLuhan's insights into technological disruptions, how they don't just flatten denominations. Orthodox particularities will continue, even if, as I continue to get a look at orthodoxy from the outside, it's an extremely chaotic animal. Orthodoxy is. And I don't say that I think many who are embracing orthodoxy claim that's a feature, not a bug. It is at home with a level of chaos in a way that a lot of the mid-20th century, especially the mainline, or some areas of Catholicism, are not down with chaos. So, for example, it forbids LGBT information aimed at children and minors and allows for civil same-sex partnerships, but not marriage equality. And so, okay, so to what degree is Hungary really Rod Dreer's Xanadu? I don't know. You might think that amounts to imposing Christianity on those who don't share the Christian faith, but you must concede that there's no such thing as pure neutrality in these matters. And I think Dreer, as much as anyone, is sort of embodies so many of these tensions, because on one hand, he is an alarmist or an alarmer, whatever, if you take offense at the alarmist, but that's what he does in his blog. His blog is an alarm. His blog is a klaxon. It's a bang, 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 bang. And sometimes he's right and sometimes he's wrong, but alarming he will do and be. But at the same time, if you meet Rod and you talk to Rod and you go to, let's say, an in-person event with Rod, this is the kind of nuance you'll get from him. Because Rod is friends with Andrew Sullivan. Rod is friends with people who, if you have the personality profile where you take this alarm in and you become a living, breathing meat sack alarmist, or at least a very neurotic alarmist, you will have the spectrum is actually more the purity spectrum, and it's the spectrum of the antithesis within the Reformed tradition, even within someone as foundational to my own particular of Dutch Calvinism, you have someone like Abram Kuyper. Abram Kuyper was both pushed the antithesis, which is sort of the center of alarmism, and common grace, which is the antithetical side of it. And Kuyper had that in himself. And so that creates this weird situation right now where you have culture warriors like Chuck Colson, who was a Kuyperian, and then you have culture warriors in denial like Kristen Kobes-Dumay, who both embrace the mantle of Kuyperianism. Okay? So Dreer is sort of that. Now, Kuyper was a polymath. Kuyper founded newspapers, trade unions, became political party, established pillarization in the Netherlands, was prime minister, was a theologian. Kuyper did all of these things at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Phenomenal figure. But all of these tensions were in Kuyper, and all of those tensions were held together in what Kuyper produced. Now, a lot of what Kuyper produced has inspired a lot of thinking and writing, but has never really, and this is going to break the heart of a lot of the people with Dutch last names and those who love those with Dutch last names and love neo-Calvinist thought, C.W. Weeks. It's never... They will be out there crying, neo-Calvinism has never been tried. Was it not tried at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century in the Netherlands? And is it there anymore? Which is what provokes a lot of more alarmist, antithetical neo-Calvinists out there. But if you read what Dreer does with, let's say, Hungary, you can see the tensions in Dreer. And if you listen to Kingsnorth, I know Kingsnorth takes some crap from some of my friends to the right of me because he's not clear on same-sex marriage. Now, again, within Orthodoxy, there are some people who are crystal clear about being crystal clear. Dyer. They go to Orthodoxy because they want the clarity. And Gavin Ortland's video on this was right in many ways. People are looking for stability. People are looking for rigor. People are looking for tradition. And those are the things that Paul Kingsnorth is looking for. But how can they all be sort of within the same movement? Well, you can ask the same thing about neo-evangelicalism. Metagelicalism has all of these aspects, and they're in conversation with each other. I got to go down and do something that I at least marked because I have so little time to do this because I've got to pick up people at the airport. I thought I marked it on this. More from Dreer. As I write the Benedict options, Christians cannot surrender entirely to Quietism, that is, to total withdrawal from political activity. If nothing else, we have to fight for religious liberty, for our right to be left alone. Oh, that's liberalism, religious liberty. You've got harder edges of orthodoxy that they're not there. Plus, there are many other... Dreer is like the alarm on the wall where he's sounding the alarm, but the factory that produced him used steel and Henry Ford's, industrialization, mass production. I mean, Dreer is a product of all of this. And so all of these tensions are there. And again, that is deeply metagelical. And again, that word, so like God number one, God number two, this word will probably evolve, but I think this will probably be more like estuary. We'll see if it gets picked up. Besides which, a Christian doesn't release us. And so where I agree with Paul, and this point is in the Benedict options, that we Christians have lost the culture. It's deeply neo-evangelical. It's deeply, again, if you read Marsden and fundamentalism in the late 19th, early 20th century, these same motivations, these same anxieties, but it's far less segmented like fundamentalism was, which is part of what made neo-evangelicalism so popular. And now, in fact, it's breaking out into the Catholic and the Orthodox. And like with neo-evangelicalism, people aren't necessarily leaving their denominations. The denominations and traditions aren't going away, but there are new grounds between these denominations that are probably in some ways functioning more powerfully than the denominations themselves. And I think that is what was at the heart of neo-evangelicalism. And when it comes to the evangelization of the people of the West, it is the spirit in the marketplace between that will act like C.S. Lewis's Hallway or John Vervaeke's Philosophical Silk Road, because the metagelical hallway it's sort of the metagelical entrance to Lewis's hallway, and people are going to find denominations and traditions with which to make home, but the hallway's getting wider. Now, if I want to thumbnail this and make the pickups I need to close this now. I could probably go for another hour on this. I've got so many thoughts on this, but I really want to get this out there and hear what you all have to say. So please leave a comment.